In the heart of the bustling city, where the streets seemed alive with unending motion, a young woman named Emily found solace in the quiet corners of her world. Emily, a waitress by day, held tightly to her dreams of becoming a musician. She lived in a small, unassuming apartment where her greatest treasure rested, an aged violin, gifted to her by her late grandfather. This violin was more than just an instrument. It was her connection to a legacy of resilience and hope. Her grandfather, once a musician in a modest town orchestra, had given her the violin shortly before his passing. "Emily," he had said, his voice steady with a wisdom born of years, "this violin isn't just wood and strings. It's your bridge to something greater. Keep playing and one day, it will take you to places you've only dreamed of." Those words echoed in her heart each time she held the instrument, a lifeline tethering her to the aspirations she refused to abandon. Emily's upbringing was far from lavish. Her mother stitched long hours as a seamstress, while her father, a carpenter, spent his days hunched over his workbench. Their combined efforts barely kept the family afloat, let alone allowed for luxuries like formal music lessons or a new instrument. The city's beauty was undeniable, but it was overshadowed by the struggles of those like Emily, whose lives were shaped by the daily grind. Every evening, after serving Savannah's wealthiest residents at a high-end restaurant, Emily would rush home to her violin. She would retreat to a tiny room her parents had set aside for her practice. In the stillness of the night, when the city's hum softened, Emily would pour her soul into the music, her fingers dancing across the strings. This was her escape, her sanctuary. The violin didn't just play music, it sang her struggles, her dreams, and her undying hope for something better. But reality often struck hard. Rejection letters from prestigious music schools piled up, their words bruising her spirit. "You have potential," they would say, "but we regret to inform you." Every letter stung like a fresh wound, yet Emily never allowed despair to silence her. "As long as I can play," she would remind herself, "there is still hope." Late one night, after yet another rigorous practice session, Emily placed her violin back in its case. She lingered, her fingers grazing the worn wood as her thoughts drifted to the lives she imagined for others, ones filled with applause and spotlight, a stark contrast to her own. In her small, dim room, she whispered a silent vow: someday, someone would hear her music. And when they did, they would see her not as a waitress but as the artist she truly was. The Whitman estate was a world apart from Emily's small apartment. Its grand ballroom, bathed in golden light from glimmering chandeliers, was the epitome of extravagance. Everything sparkled: the marble floors, the gold-framed mirrors, the endless parade of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. The air was filled with the low murmur of conversation, punctuated by the clink of champagne glasses. It was a spectacle of wealth and privilege, and Emily was there, not as a guest, but as part of the invisible staff. As Emily moved through the crowd in her plain black uniform, balancing a tray of delicate hors d'oeuvres, she tried to make herself as unobtrusive as possible. The wealthy patrons floated through the room, speaking of their opulent lifestyles as if they were commonplace. Vacations in the Hamptons, yachts in Monaco, and fortunes made in stock markets were the norm in this world. To Emily, it all felt surreal, like stepping into a movie she had no role in. At the center of it all was Nathaniel Whitman, the man responsible for the evening's lavish affair. Nathaniel was everything Emily was not: born into unimaginable wealth, exuding confidence and control. His sharp smile seemed permanently etched onto his face, though it rarely reached his piercing eyes. This party, like all his others, was a stage for him to showcase his power, ensuring everyone in Savannah's upper crust remembered their place beneath him. Emily had worked these events before and knew to keep her head down, but tonight, Nathaniel's gaze settled on her. He was in the middle of a conversation with several influential guests when he noticed her, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. Something about her caught his attention, perhaps the way she moved with quiet determination, or the weariness that seemed etched into her features. Whatever it was, it amused him. "Excuse me," Nathaniel's voice cut through the surrounding chatter, sharp and commanding. Emily froze. She glanced up briefly, her eyes meeting his for a fraction of a second before darting away. The other servers had warned her about him, about his habit of singling out staff members for his own amusement. Steeling herself, she approached him, careful not to spill the champagne on her tray. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice deceptively casual. "Emily," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Emily," he repeated, letting the name linger on his tongue. "And tell me, Emily, what do you do when you're not serving drinks?" She hesitated, unsure of where this was going. "I play the violin," she admitted quietly, almost regretting the words the moment they escaped her lips. Nathaniel's smile widened, but there was something unsettling about it. "A violinist, how charming," he said, turning to the men beside him. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have an artist among us." His words, though delivered with an air of jest, drew the attention of those nearby. Emily felt their eyes on her, judging, mocking. Her stomach twisted as Nathaniel continued, his tone dripping with feigned interest. "Well then, Emily, why don't you show us? There's a violin over there with the orchestra. Play something for us." The room fell quiet, the weight of his challenge suffocating. Emily's palms grew clammy, and her heart thundered in her chest. She wanted to say no, to walk away, but she knew better. Refusing Nathaniel Whitman wasn't an option. His command wasn't a request, it was an order, and the consequences of defiance were too daunting to imagine. With trembling hands, Emily set her tray down and walked toward the orchestra's stand. The violin waiting there wasn't hers. It was sleek and polished, a far cry from the well-loved instrument she had practiced on for years. As she lifted it, the bow felt unfamiliar in her grasp, foreign and heavy. Behind her, Nathaniel leaned casually against a column, arms crossed, his smug expression a silent reminder of her precarious position. The crowd's murmurs faded as she positioned the violin on her shoulder, her bow hovering above the strings. For a moment, she closed her eyes, inhaling deeply to steady herself. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "This violin is your bridge, Emily. Play and let it carry you." She opened her eyes and began to play. The first note was tentative, almost shy, but as the melody unfolded, something inside her shifted. Her fingers found their rhythm, and her grip on the bow relaxed. She played the piece her grandfather had taught her, a hauntingly beautiful melody, steeped in sorrow but laced with hope. Each note carried the weight of her struggles, her dreams, and the relentless determination that had brought her here. The laughter and whispers that had rippled through the room earlier faded to nothing. The crowd stood transfixed, their smug smiles replaced by something softer, almost reverent. Even Nathaniel, who had been so confident in his plan to humiliate her, found his expression faltering. The music seemed to reach inside him, pulling at something long buried and forgotten. As the final note hung in the air, the room remained silent for a moment. Then, slowly, applause began to build, growing louder and more fervent. Emily stood motionless, her breath shaky as she processed what had just happened. She had braced herself for ridicule, but instead, she was met with admiration. Somewhere in the crowd, Nathaniel clapped, though his expression was unreadable. Emily caught his gaze for a fleeting moment, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes other than arrogance. It was fleeting, but it was there, respect. The applause was still echoing through the grand ballroom when Emily carefully placed the borrowed violin back on its stand. Her hands lingered on the strings for a moment before she straightened, her heart still racing from the intensity of her performance. She could feel the weight of countless eyes on her, but their gazes no longer carried the sting of condescension. Instead, there was admiration, even awe. It was an unfamiliar feeling, and Emily wasn't quite sure how to process it. At the back of the room, Nathaniel Whitman stepped forward. His slow, deliberate clap cut through the applause, and the crowd gradually quieted. His sharp features betrayed nothing as he approached Emily, though the faint smirk that usually played on his lips was gone. For the first time that night, he seemed uncharacteristically serious. "Bravo," he said, his voice low but carrying an undeniable weight. "That was unexpected." Emily's throat tightened. She wasn't sure if his words were meant as a compliment or something else entirely. His gaze bore into hers, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade. She had expected smugness, perhaps a cruel joke about her unexpected triumph. Instead, Nathaniel looked at her as though he was seeing her for the first time. "You have a rare talent," he added, his voice softer now. "It's not every day someone manages to leave this crowd speechless." Emily wanted to respond, but her thoughts were a whirlwind. Was this the same man who had so gleefully put her on the spot moments ago? And now he was complimenting her? Before she could make sense of it, another figure emerged from the crowd, drawing her attention. The man was older, his silver hair gleaming under the chandeliers, and his presence commanded instant respect. He moved with purpose, his eyes never leaving Emily as he approached. When he reached her, he extended a hand, his expression kind but serious. "You play beautifully," he said warmly. "Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Richard Harrington, conductor of the New York Philharmonic." Emily's breath hitched. She stared at him, wide-eyed, struggling to believe what she'd just heard. Richard Harrington was a legend in the world of classical music, a man whose name alone could open doors that had always been closed to her. "I'm Emily," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard smiled, a twinkle of encouragement in his eyes. "I know who you are, Emily. I heard something extraordinary tonight. Your music isn't just technically impressive, it's filled with heart. That's a rare gift." She felt her cheeks flush as his words sank in. This couldn't be real. Moments ago, she had been a nameless waitress, blending into the background of the Whitman estate. Now, one of the most influential figures in classical music was praising her. "I'd like to invite you to audition for a place in the Philharmonic," Richard continued, his tone serious but inviting. "It's not an opportunity one extend lightly, but I believe you have what it takes to succeed." Emily's mind reeled. The New York Philharmonic. An audition. It was the kind of chance she had dreamed about for years, but had always seemed impossibly out of reach. Her voice trembled as she replied, "I don't know what to say." "Thank you." "There's nothing to thank me for yet," Richard said with a gentle smile. "The rest is up to you. But I'll tell you this, you've already proven you belong in a room like this. Don't forget that." With those parting words, he gave her a reassuring nod and disappeared back into the crowd. Emily stood frozen, her thoughts racing. This was it, the chance of a lifetime. But could she really do it? Could a waitress from Savannah, with no formal training, hope to compete at such a level? Before she could dwell on her doubts, her eyes caught Nathaniel's. He was standing a few feet away, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place. His usual smugness had been replaced by something almost contemplative, though she didn't trust it. Still, there was no denying the role he had played in bringing her to this moment. As their gazes met, he gave her a small, tight smile. "It seems you've made quite an impression tonight," he said, his tone measured but lacking his usual edge. Emily blinked, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to thank him, but another part of her remembered his earlier actions, his attempt to humiliate her in front of everyone. Whatever respect she had earned from him now, it didn't erase the fact that he had sought to tear her down first. "You didn't expect me to be any good," she said finally, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions churning inside her. Nathaniel's smile faded slightly, and he inclined his head. "I'll admit I didn't. But you proved me wrong." There was something almost like respect in his tone, though Emily wasn't sure what to make of it. Before she could press further, another guest called for Nathaniel's attention, and he turned away, disappearing into the crowd. Emily was left standing alone once again, but this time, something was different. The dream that had always felt so distant now seemed closer, almost tangible. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen, truly seen, and for Emily, that was more than enough to carry her forward. The following days passed in a haze for Emily. Her quiet, predictable life, once defined by the routine of waiting tables and practicing her violin in solitude, had been upended. The offer from Richard Harrington wasn't just an opportunity, it was a lifeline. The idea that she might audition for the New York Philharmonic, one of the most prestigious orchestras in the world, filled her with equal parts excitement and terror. Every spare moment was dedicated to preparation. After her shifts at the restaurant, she would retreat to her cramped apartment and pick up her violin. Each night, she practiced until her fingers ached, pouring every ounce of energy she had into perfecting the piece she planned to play at the audition. The notes she had played 1,000 times before now carried a new weight, a new urgency. This was no longer just a dream, it was a chance to prove she belonged in a world that had always seemed out of reach. But as the days ticked by, doubt began to creep in. The weight of the opportunity pressed heavily on her, whispering fears she couldn't ignore. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she failed in front of the people who could shape her future? Emily tried to push these thoughts aside, but they lingered, like shadows that refused to fade. The night before her first official rehearsal with local musicians, a practice session arranged by Richard to prepare her for the audition, Emily barely slept. She arrived at the rehearsal hall the next day clutching her violin case tightly, her heart pounding as she stepped inside. The hall was grand in its own way, with high ceilings and polished wooden floors that echoed every step. Emily scanned the room nervously. The other musicians were seasoned professionals, their polished instruments and effortless confidence making her feel out of place. She unpacked her violin carefully, her hands trembling as she adjusted the strings. Compared to the gleaming, expensive instruments around her, her violin, with its worn surface and scuffed edges, seemed small and inadequate. The conductor, a stern-looking man with silver hair, called for silence. Emily took a deep breath and focused on the sheet music in front of her. The rehearsal began, and immediately, she felt the difference. The other musicians played with precision and ease, their sound rich and full. Emily struggled to keep up, her bow slipping and her fingers faltering as she tried to match their tempo. "Miss Emily," the conductor said, pausing the session. His tone was neutral but firm. "You need to stay with the tempo. This is an ensemble, not a solo performance." His words stung, but Emily nodded quickly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She tried again, pushing herself to stay in time with the group, but the pressure only seemed to magnify her mistakes. By the end of the session, her confidence was in tatters. Packing up her violin, Emily avoided the eyes of the other musicians as they left the hall. She stepped outside into the crisp evening air, the weight of her doubts pressing down on her. The rehearsal had shown her just how far she had to go, and the voice in her head whispered that she might not be ready. Rough session? The voice startled her, and she turned to see one of the musicians from the rehearsal, a woman in her mid-30s carrying a cello case. Her expression was kind, her smile warm and understanding. "Yeah," Emily admitted, her voice shaky. "I guess you could say that." The woman nodded, stepping closer. "We've all been there. Don't let it get to you. You've got something most of us don't." Emily raised an eyebrow, confused. "What's that?" "Heart," the woman said simply. "I heard it in your playing. Sure, you made some mistakes, but the emotion you bring to your music, you can't teach that." Emily blinked, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She had always played from her heart, pouring her struggles and dreams into every note. Maybe that was why her music resonated, even when she felt out of her depth. "Thank you," she said softly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I needed to hear that." The woman patted her shoulder reassuringly before heading off into the night, leaving Emily standing on the steps of the hall. The cold air no longer felt as harsh, and though her doubts still lingered, they didn't seem as overwhelming. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. While Emily wrestled with her doubts, Nathaniel Whitman found himself struggling with emotions he had long buried. He had spent years building his empire, a life meticulously crafted around control and calculated decisions. But since the night of Emily's performance, something inside him had shifted. Her music had awakened a part of him he thought he'd left behind, a part tied to memories he had spent years trying to forget. The haunting melody she had played wasn't just beautiful, it was familiar. Nathaniel couldn't stop hearing it, couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something deeply personal. And then it hit him. It was the same melody his mother used to play on the piano when he was a child. It had been her composition, a private piece she never shared with the world. The realization struck him like a tidal wave. His mother had been the one person in his life who had understood him. She had been gentle, kind, and deeply passionate about music. When she played, their home filled with a magic that Nathaniel carried with him, even after her untimely death in a car accident. The grief of losing her had hardened him, and he had buried himself in his father's business, determined never to feel that kind of pain again. But Emily's performance had brought it all rushing back. How could she possibly know that melody? It wasn't something anyone outside his family would have heard. The thought gnawed at him, stirring questions he couldn't ignore. Determined to find answers, Nathaniel quietly began making inquiries into Emily's background. What he discovered only deepened the mystery. Emily's family history revealed little. She was the daughter of a seamstress and a carpenter, born and raised far from the opulent world Nathaniel inhabited. She had no formal music education, no connections to prominent musicians. But there was one detail that stood out: her grandfather. He had been a small-town musician, but his name sparked a memory for Nathaniel. His mother had once mentioned a young violinist she had loved before marrying Nathaniel's father. Could it be the same man? The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Nathaniel's mother and Emily's grandfather had shared a past, one that had been buried in the sands of time. The melody Emily had played, it wasn't just music. It was a thread connecting two lives, two generations. Nathaniel's heart ached at the realization. The same music that had once filled his home had traveled a different path, landing in Emily's hands. He knew he couldn't ignore this connection. But what was he supposed to do with it? Nathaniel had always been a man of action, someone who shaped circumstances to his advantage. Yet this was different. This wasn't about business or power. It was about family, about something raw and deeply personal. The answer came in the form of an unexpected phone call. Richard Harrington wanted to speak with him about Emily. Nathaniel took the call, his curiosity piqued. "Garrett," Richard began, his tone warm but direct, "I've rarely seen someone with Emily's raw talent. But talent alone won't be enough for her to succeed. She needs support, resources, guidance. And that's where you come in." Nathaniel's brow furrowed. "Me? What makes you think I'm the right person for this?" "Because you've already taken an interest in her," Richard said simply. "And because you have the means to help her in ways no one else can. Emily has a gift, but it's fragile. If she's going to step into the world of professional music, she'll need more than just her violin and determination. She'll need someone who believes in her." Nathaniel was silent for a moment, grappling with the weight of Richard's words. He had spent his life keeping people at arm's length, avoiding the kind of vulnerability that came with truly caring. But Emily had stirred something in him, something he couldn't ignore. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his tone measured. "That's all I ask," Richard replied. "She deserves a chance." After the call ended, Nathaniel sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline. The melody played in his mind again, intertwining with memories of his mother. He thought of Emily's quiet determination, the way she had defied his expectations and captivated an entire room. For the first time in years, Nathaniel felt a pull he couldn't resist. He had spent so long building walls around himself, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to let one of them down. Emily wasn't just a stranger with talent. She was connected to his past in ways he couldn't fully understand yet. And if helping her meant honoring his mother's legacy, perhaps that was a step he was finally ready to take. Nathaniel wasted no time after his conversation with Richard Harrington. For a man accustomed to control, action was second nature, and he knew that if he was going to help Emily, he had to start by confronting his own missteps. The humiliation he had subjected her to at the Whitman estate still lingered in his mind, a bitter reminder of the man he had become over the years. If he was going to extend an olive branch, he would need to address the damage he'd done first. Finding Emily wasn't difficult. Her modest apartment was only a short drive from the center of Savannah, tucked away in a neighborhood far removed from the grandeur of the world Nathaniel inhabited. The building was old but well kept, its simplicity a stark contrast to the luxury Nathaniel was used to. As he parked his sleek car outside and stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, he felt the first pangs of discomfort. He didn't belong here, and yet, this was exactly where he needed to be. When Emily opened the door, her surprise was evident. She stood there, violin case in hand, clearly on her way out. Her expression shifted quickly, confusion mingling with guardedness as she took in the sight of Nathaniel standing on her doorstep. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone neutral but firm. Nathaniel cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in his tailored suit. He had faced boardrooms full of executives without flinching, but standing here in front of Emily, he felt uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I came to talk," he said evenly, "about what happened at the Whitman estate. And about what's next." Emily hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. For a moment, she looked like she might send him away, but then she stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "All right, let's talk." Nathaniel stepped inside, taking in the small but cozy apartment. The living room was modestly furnished, with a well-worn couch and a coffee table scattered with sheet music. A framed photo of Emily's family sat on the mantel, alongside a few small trinkets. It was a space that spoke of hard work and quiet resilience, and Nathaniel found himself feeling strangely out of his element. Emily sat on the edge of the couch, her posture stiff, while Nathaniel remained standing, unsure how to begin. Apologies weren't something he offered often, but he knew they were necessary now. "I owe you an apology," he started, his voice steady but sincere. "What I did at the event, putting you on the spot like that, it wasn't right. I acted out of arrogance, and I wanted to humiliate you. I'm not proud of that." Emily's eyes flicked up to meet his, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. She hadn't expected this, a genuine apology from the man who had tried to tear her down in front of an entire room of people. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about that night," Nathaniel continued, his tone softening. "And I realize now that I was wrong about you. You're not just a waitress or someone to be dismissed. You're a true talent, Emily, and your music is something extraordinary." Emily crossed her arms, her expression softening slightly but still wary. "So why are you really here? To ease your conscience?" "Partly," Nathaniel admitted, not flinching under her scrutiny. "But also because I want to help you. I believe in your talent, and I want to make sure you have the opportunity to reach your full potential." Emily's brow furrowed, her skepticism clear. "And why would you want to do that?" Nathaniel's lips pressed into a thin line as he considered his next words. He had spent years building walls around himself, but if he was going to be honest with Emily, he needed to let at least one of those walls down. "Because you reminded me of something I lost a long time ago," he said finally. "Your music, it brought back memories of my mother. She used to play that same melody, and it was like hearing her again after all these years." Emily blinked, her confusion deepening. "Your mother? But that melody, it's been in my family for as long as I can remember. My grandfather taught it to me." Nathaniel hesitated, his gaze steady as he replied, "That's what I've been trying to figure out. I've done some digging, Emily, and I think there's more to this connection than either of us realized." He took a breath before continuing, his voice low but firm. "Your grandfather wasn't just a musician. He was my mother's first love. And there's more. The woman you've always known as your mother, she isn't your biological mother. My mother is." The words hung in the air, heavy and almost incomprehensible. Emily stared at him, her mind reeling. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That can't be true." "I know it's a lot to take in," Nathaniel said gently. "But it's the truth. Your grandfather raised you as his own after my mother died, keeping your real parentage a secret. He wanted to protect you from my father's world, from the kind of life that destroyed her." Emily's legs felt unsteady as she took a step back, the weight of his revelation crashing down on her. Her entire life, the foundation of everything she thought she knew, suddenly felt like it had been built on sand. Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice soft but unwavering. "You're not alone, Emily. You've never been alone. We're family, and whatever happens next, we'll figure it out together." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as the truth began to sink in. The melody that had connected them wasn't just music, it was a thread tying them to a shared past, one that had brought them to this moment. For the first time in her life, Emily felt a sense of belonging, a sense of peace. Nathaniel's gaze remained steady, offering a rare glimpse of vulnerability. "This doesn't change who you are, Emily," he said quietly. "If anything, it shows how far you've come. And now, it's your time to decide what happens next." The days that followed Nathaniel's revelation felt like a whirlwind for Emily. Her world, once so small and predictable, had expanded in ways she never thought possible. The knowledge of her true parentage, of the connection to Nathaniel and his late mother, was both overwhelming and strangely grounding. It felt like pieces of her life had been scattered for years, and now they were finally coming together. But there was no time to dwell on the past. Her audition for the New York Philharmonic loomed on the horizon, and with it, a new kind of pressure. Emily threw herself into her preparations with renewed determination. The late nights practicing in her cramped apartment were no longer solitary. Nathaniel had arranged for her to work with experienced musicians and even rented out a rehearsal space to give her room to focus. Despite his initial arrogance, Nathaniel had become an unexpected ally. He didn't just provide the resources she needed, he also offered quiet encouragement when her confidence faltered. Emily was cautious at first, unsure if she could fully trust him. But as the days turned into weeks, his actions began to speak louder than words. He wasn't just helping her out of guilt or obligation, he genuinely believed in her talent. Richard Harrington, too, was a constant presence in her journey. His guidance was firm but invaluable, pushing Emily to refine her technique and develop her stage presence. The audience isn't just listening, he told her during one rehearsal. They're watching, feeling. You have to connect with them. Make them see what you feel. Emily practiced relentlessly, but the doubts still crept in. Standing on the precipice of something so monumental, she couldn't help but question whether she truly belonged. She thought of the other musicians auditioning, many of whom had years of formal training and professional experience. Could she, a waitress with no formal education in music, really compete at their level? One evening, as she packed up after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Nathaniel appeared at the door. He leaned against the frame, his sharp features softened by an expression she had come to recognize as concern. "You're working yourself to the bone," he said, his tone more gentle than she expected. "You need to breathe, Emily." She sighed, tucking her violin into its case. "I can't afford to. Not with everything riding on this." Nathaniel stepped into the room, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. "I get it," he said. "When I was building my company, I worked like this. Relentlessly. But it's not sustainable. You need balance." Emily raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement creeping into her tired expression. "Balance? That's a surprising lesson coming from you." Nathaniel's lips quirked into a faint smile. "Fair point. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that pushing yourself too hard can backfire. You have the talent, Emily. You've already proven that. Now you just need to trust yourself." His words settled over her like a soothing balm. Trusting herself was easier said than done, but hearing it from someone who had once underestimated her meant more than she cared to admit. When the day of the audition finally arrived, Emily stood backstage at the concert hall, her hands trembling as she clutched her violin. The air buzzed with anticipation as other musicians milled about, their polished instruments gleaming under the dim backstage lights. Emily felt small in comparison, her nerves threatening to swallow her whole. Then she heard a familiar voice. "You've got this." She turned to see Nathaniel standing nearby, his tailored suit immaculate as always, but his expression softer than usual. He didn't say anything more, didn't need to. His presence was enough. Moments later, Richard appeared, his calm demeanor a steadying force. "It's time," he said, his voice warm with encouragement. "Remember, it's not about perfection. It's about heart. Let them feel what you feel." Emily nodded, taking a deep breath as she adjusted the strap of her violin. This was it. The culmination of years of practice, countless late nights, and unwavering determination. She stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her as she faced the panel of judges. The auditorium was cavernous, its silence almost oppressive as she positioned her violin and lifted her bow. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She thought of her grandfather, of the nights spent practicing in her tiny room, of the people who had doubted her, and the ones who had believed in her. Then she began to play. The first notes filled the air, soft and tentative, but as the melody grew, so did her confidence. Her fingers danced across the strings, the music flowing from her with a raw, unfiltered emotion that seemed to fill every corner of the hall. She didn't just play the notes, she lived them, pouring her soul into each rise and fall of the melody. When she finished, the final note hanging in the air like a delicate thread, there was silence. It stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Then, one of the judges leaned forward, their expression unreadable, and said, "Thank you." Emily nodded, lowering her violin and stepping off the stage. The weight of what she had just done hit her all at once, and her legs felt unsteady as she made her way backstage. Nathaniel and Richard were waiting for her, their expressions a mixture of pride and anticipation. "You were incredible," Richard said, his voice steady and full of conviction. Nathaniel simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. "No matter what happens next, you've already won." Emily let out a shaky breath, the tension finally beginning to ease. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were right. The waiting was the hardest part. Emily sat in the quiet backstage lounge, her violin case resting beside her as she stared at the floor. Her mind replayed the audition over and over, dissecting every note, every movement. Doubts whispered in the corners of her mind, but she clung to the words Richard and Nathaniel had spoken, words of belief, of encouragement. When Richard reappeared, his smile was calm and reassuring. "They'll deliberate for a while," he said, sitting down beside her. "No matter the outcome, you gave them something they won't forget." Emily nodded, though her nerves were still raw. She glanced at Nathaniel, who stood by the doorway, his arms crossed as he watched her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. For a man who rarely betrayed emotion, he seemed almost proud. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into eternity, until finally a member of the panel approached. Emily stood as the woman offered a small, professional smile. "Emily, the judges were deeply impressed," she began, her tone measured but kind. "They saw something in your performance that can't be taught: heart, passion. It's the kind of gift that sets true artists apart. We would like to offer you a place with the New York Philharmonic." Emily froze, the words sinking in like a delayed wave. "Wait, really?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The woman's smile softened. "Yes, really. Congratulations." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as the weight of the moment hit her. This wasn't a dream, it was real. All the years of struggle, the late nights, the rejection letters, they had led her here. To this. As the woman departed, leaving Emily to process the news, Richard clasped her shoulder. "I told you," he said warmly. "This is just the beginning. You've earned this." Emily turned to Nathaniel, who had stepped closer, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "You did it," he said simply, his voice quiet but filled with something unspoken. "Thank you," Emily said, her voice breaking slightly as the tears spilled over. "For everything." Nathaniel shook his head, his lips curving into a rare, genuine smile. "You don't owe me thanks. You did this. You were always capable. You just needed someone to believe in you." The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation. The Philharmonic schedule was demanding, but Emily met it head-on, her confidence growing with each rehearsal. For the first time, she felt like she belonged in the world she had always dreamed of. But amidst her newfound success, Emily didn't forget the people who had shaped her journey. Her parents, who had sacrificed so much to support her, her grandfather, whose violin had carried her here, Richard, who had opened the door, and even Nathaniel, whose unexpected transformation had given her the courage to step through it. One evening, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Emily found herself sitting with Nathaniel in the quiet of her new practice room. The space was bright and spacious, a far cry from the cramped corners she used to play in. Nathaniel had insisted on helping her secure the apartment, saying only, "You need a place where you can thrive." "Do you ever think about her?" Emily asked suddenly, her voice soft. She didn't have to clarify. She knew Nathaniel would understand. He nodded, his gaze distant. "All the time. My mother was everything good about my childhood. I lost that when I lost her." Emily hesitated before speaking. "Do you think she'd be proud of us? Of what we're doing now?" Nathaniel's lips curved into a faint smile, his expression thoughtful. "I think she'd be proud of you. And maybe, just maybe, I'm starting to give her a reason to be proud of me too." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Emily felt the bond between them deepen. It wasn't just about shared blood or a common past, It was about the music, the dreams, and the hope that had carried them both through the hardest times in their lives. Months later, when Emily stepped onto the stage of Carnegie Hall for her debut performance with the New York Philharmonic, she thought of all those moments. The struggles, the triumphs, the people who had lifted her when she couldn't stand on her own. As she raised her bow and the first note filled the air, she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. This was her bridge, her dream, and her legacy. And she was ready to claim it. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Your interest and support inspire us to bring you more captivating tales filled with emotions, twists, and the complexity of life, love, betrayal, and redemption. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. We value your voice and want to hear what you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story, and hit the notification bell to stay updated. Thank you for bringing this channel to life with your views and encouragement. See you in the next story.